This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Today we're going back to the 1930s.
It's a time period that you specifically wanted to explore.
And it revolves around the Declaration of Lima.
And its impact on U.S. Latin American relations.
Oh, yeah.
It's a fascinating story.
It is.
And full of intrigue.
There's shifting power dynamics.
And you know what?
Believe it or not.
There are some really interesting parallels to what's happening in the world today.
Absolutely.
So
it's a period full of twists and turns for sure.
Yeah.
And I think, what's really striking is the context of the 1930s.
I mean, the world is really holding its breath.
You have fascism on the rise in Europe.
Japan is flexing its muscles in Asia.
And the U.S. is looking to solidify its influence.
In what it considers its own backyard.
The Western Hemisphere.
Right. So the U.S. is looking around and realizing,
oh boy, the world's about to explode.
But to really understand the Declaration of Lima?
I think we need to go back even further.
Okay.
What about the Monroe Doctrine?
Oh, sure.
1823.
The U.S. basically tells Europe,
hands off the Western Hemisphere.
Oh, well,
right, the Monroe Doctrine really sets the stage.
It essentially gave the U.S. a claim.
Over the entire region.
Establishing its dominance.
At least in theory.
And you can imagine how that played out over time.
Particularly for Latin American nations.
Right. It's almost like a parent saying,
I'm doing this for your own good.
Exactly.
To protect you.
Yeah.
But as we know, those protective measures
sometimes can feel a little overbearing.
Exactly. And by the 1930s, things are getting even more complicated.
The U.S. is realizing that its old big stick diplomacy.
Intervening militarily whenever it saw fit.
Wasn't going to cut it anymore.
Especially with new players like Germany,
Italy,
Japan,
entering the scene.
All vying for influence and resources in Latin America.
So you've got these rising powers
sniffing around Latin America.
The U.S. is starting to sweat a little bit.
They do.
Enter FDR's good neighbor policy.
Think of it as a strategic shift.
A move away from blatant interventionism.
Toward a more,
shall we say,
cooperative approach.
The goal, to keep Latin America firmly on the U.S. side.
As the world teeters on the brink of war.
Okay, but let's be real.
You can't just flip a switch and go,
from we're in charge,
to let's be friends.
There has to be some kind of transition, right?
Sure.
What are some of the stepping stones leading up to the Declaration of Lima?
You're right, it wasn't a sudden change of heart.
A crucial turning point was the Inter-American Conference for the Maintenance of Peace.
Held in Buenos Aires in 1936.
This was like a diplomatic first date.
Where everyone agreed to consult each other in case of war.
The tension in Europe was palpable.
And this agreement hinted that everyone was feeling the heat.
So Buenos Aires was the first date.
A little bit of cautious flirting.
But by 1938,
the world is holding its breath.
War feels inevitable.
What happens in Lima?
Well, in Lima, things get serious.
They realize those polite agreements in Buenos Aires. The Declaration of Lima signed by 21 nations in the Americas.
It's a whole different ballgame.
It essentially says,
we're in this together, folks.
An attack on one is an attack on all.
Wow.
That's a bold statement.
A united front against the bullies, huh?
I'm liking this already. But let's break it down. What exactly did the Declaration of Lima lay out?
What were its key articles?
Think of it as a set of rules for a peaceful neighborhood.
It emphasized non-intervention in each other's affairs.
No more meddling.
Or imperialistic actions.
It called for the peaceful resolution of disputes.
Prioritizing diplomacy over force.
And it stressed international cooperation.
For peace and security.
But here's the catch.
The Declaration, while a significant step,
was also a product of its time.
It reflected the anxieties and power dynamics of the late 1930s.
Okay, so it's not just some idealistic feel-good document.
There's a lot more going on beneath the surface.
Right.
This is where it starts to get really interesting.
We've got the Declaration.
A promise of unity and cooperation.
But we also have this backdrop of global tensions.
And the U.S. trying to maintain its grip on the Western Hemisphere.
Exactly. And that's where the good neighbor policy, which the Declaration of Lima really solidified, comes into play. It becomes this fascinating case study of how those high-minded ideals clash with the realities of power.
Okay, so let's dive into that. Did the U.S. actually walk the walk when it came to the good neighbor policy, or was it all just talk?
Well, It's complicated. As you might expect, there were some concrete actions like the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Haiti and the Dominican Republic. That was a significant step back from the interventionist policies of the past.
Okay, so that sounds promising. But you mentioned earlier that there's another side to this story.
Yes, there were definitely some contradictions. The U.S., while promoting non-intervention, continued to support authoritarian leaders like Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic and Fulgencio Batista in Cuba.
Hold on, wait a minute. Did you just say the Declaration was all about respecting each other's sovereignty? This sounds a bit hypocritical, doesn't it?
You've hit on a really important point. This is where we see the tension between the ideals of the Declaration and the strategic calculations of the U.S. stability in the region was a top priority. And for the U.S., that sometimes meant supporting strongmen, even if they weren't exactly champions of democracy.
So it's a bit of a mixed bag, some steps towards cooperation, but also some, let's say, flexible interpretations of the Declaration's principles. What about Mexico? I know they had that whole oil nationalization thing going on.
Ah, yes. The Mexican oil crisis in 1938, Mexican President Lázaro Cárdenas nationalized the oil industry, which understandably ruffled some feathers in the U.S., especially among powerful oil companies.
I can imagine this is a direct challenge to U.S. economic interest. How did Roosevelt react?
This is where Roosevelt's commitment to the good neighbor policy was truly tested. Instead of resorting to military force or economic retaliation, he chose diplomacy.
Wow, that's a pretty big deal considering the stakes he actually chose negotiation over force.
He did, and it was a defining moment for the good neighbor policy. It demonstrated that the U.S., at least in this instance, was willing to prioritize peaceful solutions even when faced with significant economic pressure. And it wasn't just Mexico. Let's not forget the U.S. role in mediating the Chaco War between Bolivia and Paraguay in the early 1930s, another example of favoring diplomacy over intervention.
Okay, so the good neighbor policy spurred on by the Declaration of Lima wasn't a simple black and white story. It was a complex mix of actions and motivations, some genuine efforts at cooperation, and some strategic calculations to protect U.S. interests. What a tangled web we weave, right?
Right.
But how did historians view this? How do they interpret the good neighbor policy and its impact on U.S. Latin American relations?
That's where things get even more interesting. Historians have debated the legacy of the good neighbor policy for decades. Some view it as a genuinely positive shift in U.S. foreign policy, marking a departure from the interventionist practices of the past.
So a move towards a more respectful and equitable relationship with Latin America.
Yeah, exactly. But other historians argue that it was more about replacing military force with economic and cultural influence. They see it as a more subtle form of maintaining U.S. hegemony in the region. And then there's a third perspective, a more nuanced view.
Okay, tell me more about that. What does this nuanced view suggest?
This perspective acknowledges the complexities. It recognizes that the good neighbor policy combined genuine efforts at cooperation with strategic calculations aimed at ensuring hemispheric unity in the face of growing global threats. Remember, the world is on the brink of war. The U.S. needed Latin America on its side.
It seems like we're seeing a pattern here. The Declaration of Lima, the good neighbor policy, they're all about balancing these idealistic goals with the hard realities of power politics.
That's a really astute observation, and it's a tension that continues to play out in international relations to this day. But what's fascinating about the good neighbor policy is how it goes beyond traditional diplomacy. Historians also highlight the role of cultural diplomacy.
Cultural diplomacy, what do you mean by that?
Things like promoting U.S. music and film in Latin America, fostering educational exchanges, and showcasing American culture. It was a softer form of power, an attempt to win hearts and minds and ultimately strengthen U.S. influence.
So it's not just about treaties and military alliances. It's about shaping perceptions, building relationships, and using culture as a tool of diplomacy. It's kind of like a charm offensive on a grand scale.
You could say that, and it's a strategy that many countries still employ today.
Wow, this deep dive has taken us on quite a journey from the Monroe Doctrine to the rise of fascism, from diplomatic overtures to the complexities of soft power. It all started with this one seemingly simple document, the Declaration of Lima. But as we've uncovered, it's far from simple. It feels like we've peeled back layers of history,
Uncovering all these intricate connections.
between global events and the Declaration of Lima.
But let's bring it back to you, our listener.
What are some of the key takeaways here?
How should we think about the Declaration's,
Lasting impact.
I think you've hit the nail on the head.
The Declaration of Lima was more than just a symbolic gesture,
You know, it really signaled a shift
at least on the surface,
from a more paternalistic U.S. approach.
to one that, in theory,
It embraced greater equality and
of
cooperation.
Latin American nations.
But as we've seen, the reality was a bit more complicated.
The good neighbor policy, which the Declaration helped solidify.
Was a blend of genuine efforts and strategic calculations.
Exactly.
And that's the beauty of history.
It's rarely neat and tidy.
The good neighbor policy had its successes, no doubt.
It helped prevent large-scale military interventions in the region.
And it fostered a sense of Pan-Americanism.
In the face of global threats.
But it also revealed the limits of those good intentions, right?
The U.S. was still very much interested in maintaining its influence.
Even if it meant compromising on some of those lofty ideals.
Absolutely.
The U.S. continued to prioritize its own interests.
Sometimes at the expense of democratic principles in Latin America.
And that's why the legacy of the good neighbor policy is still debated by historians today.
It's a reminder that even seemingly positive changes in foreign policy
Can be intertwined with power dynamics and self-interest.
So what can we learn from all of this
What insights does the Declaration of Lima offer for us today?
as we navigate an increasingly complex world
I think the Declaration
and the era it represents?
offers a valuable lesson in the complexities of international relations,
It reminds us that cooperation and self-interest often coexist.
and that power dynamics can shape even the most well-intentioned policies.
It's like that saying, right?
There's no such a thing as a free lunch,
Every action on the world stage has consequences.
intended or unintended.
Precisely.
And for the listener,
I think the Declaration of Lima sparks a crucial question,
could a similar approach,
one that balances cooperation,
with a clear-eyed understanding of power dynamics,
be effective in addressing the geopolitical challenges?
that we face in the 21st century?
That is a powerful question to consider
And it's one that each of us
as informed citizens
needs to grapple with.
as we think about the future of international relations.
The Declaration of Lima and the Good Neighbor Policy
Despite their complexities and contradictions,
offer a fascinating case study.
to help us navigate these very issues.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past,
It's a lens through which we can better understand our present.
and make more informed decisions about the future.
Well said.
It seems like with every deep dive.
We uncover more questions than answers.
But that's the beauty of learning, isn't it?
It's about embracing the complexity.
And continually challenging our assumptions.
So, to our listener, thank you for joining us
On this journey through the fascinating world,
of the Declaration of Lima.
we encourage you to keep exploring
Keep questioning.
and keep drawing your own conclusions
How about its legacy and its relevance?
to the world we live in today.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.